Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Bruce Belsowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and welcome to our New Mobility and the Revolution of Goods Movement Conference. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. You can reach me at the email below. Our funding comes from our affiliate program. There are research on globalization, powertrains, and ITS, intelligent transportation systems, of which New Mobility and Goods Movement is one of those, and our 5 annual conferences. We always like to thank our affiliate members for participating and supporting us. They give us the funding that we need to put on our conferences. And also we have a new affiliate member, Pacific Northwest Labs. If you're interested in affiliate information, it is on our website, www.automotivefutures.org, and we'll also send you this link later on. We have research partners that cross IT organizations, OEMs, government and NGOs, as well as suppliers and consultants. Recently, we're publishing our 2021 year in review. Not only talks about what we did in 2021, but also our plans for 2022. And some of those are our research projects, our propulsion strategies for the 21st century project, as will be coming out. We've been doing it since 2008. We'll be doing that in June. We have as well as our conference in July. Our China New Energy Vehicle project that we've been doing since 2016, and New Mobility is showing up in our conferences as it is today. We have a conference coming up in April on the effects of Biden administration policies on the U.S. auto industry, and a survey that will be going out to all our affiliates and people in our database, asking them about their opinions about and how they think the administration policies will affect the automotive industry. We also have our global EV project that includes countries outside of China, our globalization studies, as well as our third U of M Automotive IQ student survey. And here we're looking at students' attitudes and seeing to see if they predict their future vehicle purchases. And speaking of students, we do have a lot of them, and they cross a number of areas: engineering, data science, economics, computer science, as well as statistics. And our research associate, Kara Elkire, who is online right now with the YouTube video and answering any questions you might have. And so if you have anything that you want to ask her, you can ask her directly through the chat. Also, we encourage you to join our LinkedIn page and follow it. We put out, we're posting 2 to 3 times a week. You can receive updates on our future conferences and speaker events. We have some discussion going on, as well as information about our conferences. And as I said, our next conference in April is going to be the effects of Biden administration policies on the auto industry, and our 14th annual propulsion strategies for the 21st century conference in July. We have 3 speakers with us today. Sina Zen from ICLE is going to be talking about the eco-logistics and sustainable delivery systems. Rick Arns from Smart Freight Center will provide a talk about the framework that they use for accurately measuring emissions across the supply chain, especially from the freight story. And Nathan Neese from Boston Consulting Group is going to be talking about a recent study that they put out that looks at the cost of implementing sustainable technologies and strategies across a number of different verticals, automotive being one of them. Zena will be our first speaker, then we'll go to Rick. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll go to Nathan, and then we'll adjourn about noon. And then we have a Meet the Speakers program that comes after that. Our post-conference, all the attendees will get a link to the presentations, and our affiliates get the link, as well as a document that summarizes the conference. In terms of the agenda, the bios, the registration, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, upcoming events, all this is on our website. You can also see this. There's a links to this in the live stream underneath the live stream that you're looking at. Also looking at, in terms of audience questions, there's a link on the live stream. I also sent it in an email to you as part of the, when I sent out the YouTube video link. There's a link there for if you want to ask a question of the speakers during our Q&A. Carol will be sending those to me, so we'll be able to answer your questions throughout the conference. When I set up the revolution in goods movement story, I was really looking at goods movement in the aggregate and as part of individual company supply chains. They could be national, they could be local, they could be global. And we also know that goods movement has been part of the automotive supply chain since the beginning of the industry. But when we look at the modern automotive industry, I try to look at it from, like, say, the 1970s and 80s with the introduction of just-in-time delivery, which also focused on efficiency, quality, and cost, as well as delivery. The combination of IT and globalization in the 90s and early 2000s formed the next revolution of the extended supply chain. And then which crossed industries and included Amazon's consumers, deliveries, Walmart, and all the others. I think right now we're at the beginning of the next revolution in sustainable goods movement and supply chains. Our speakers today will discuss a number of the different aspects of this revolution. They're going to be talking about sustainable deliveries within cities, measuring sustainability in logistics and freight systems, examining experts' views on the cost of developing complete sustainable supply chains, and examples of sustainability projects by automotive manufacturers and suppliers. Now, this is a simplistic view of the automotive supply chain. You're looking at manufacturers, tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 component suppliers, and tier 3 initial raw material suppliers. And notice in this green area is the OEM zone of visibility, where they get information and data about their processes and all the pieces that go into putting together a vehicle. And what's interesting is that, and we'll talk about this as part of our discussion, it's the tier 2 suppliers that they really don't have as much knowledge about. And in terms of sustainability, this is a key issue. So in terms of sustainability, in terms of an overview, it can be environmental, looking at energy efficiency, water management, waste management, emissions, land use, environmental compliance. Could be social, looking at human rights and anti-corruption, human resources, health and safety, social compliance, and it can be, and most likely, it's always part of economics. Stability and profitability of companies, income distribution, market competitiveness, sustainability expenditures, as well as reshoring and nearshoring. So, one of the things that you look at when you look at from an emission standpoint, you're looking at the different emissions. They have the scope 1 direct emissions from our reporting companies, scope 2 from indirectly, can be upstream as well as downstream activities, and scope 3 are also some indirect activities. Rick Arns is going to be talking about more of this in his freight discussion today. So they have, as I said, their scope 1, 2, and 3, and Rick will give a little more detail on this in his discussion. Just a few examples that we dug up, looking from the manufacturer's standpoint, from looking at upstream, downstream, as well as the reporting company itself. Volkswagen is using some blockchain technology to really look into documenting what's going on in its supply chain. Jaguar Land Rover also using blockchain. Now, supply chains traditionally have been using enterprise resource planning systems and manufacturing execution systems. But sometimes that record, digital record, is dispersed globally across multiple organizations with limited access and visibility. When you use that blockchain, you've got a distributed ledger that has potential to provide traceable, timestamped digital records that across the supply chain. So this is what some of the auto manufacturers are doing. They're also doing, as Audi's doing, supplier ratings. Now, manufacturers have always done supplier ratings. It all has to do with what they're testing for. Now, in this case, you're looking at sustainability. They send out an email asking them to participate, to complete a self-assessment, and if they feel they need to, they'll go on site to check and do a compliance check. But there's some challenges in this. For example, when you have 13,000 suppliers, you're going to get a lot of information, and it creates a tremendous amount of work inside the manufacturer. And then think about suppliers doing it with their suppliers. This is going to be a really challenging story. Looking forward to Nathan's presentation on the work that they've been doing and how manufacturers might be able to manage all this. But of course, one of the things they look at for sustainability, do you have an environmental program that includes targets, activities? Do you have a management person involved, is responsible for this? And do you have a CSR, a sustainability report that your company puts out? So these are some of the major areas that the manufacturers are looking at. They've been doing these kinds of ratings of their suppliers for costs, for delivery, for quality, for many, many decades now. But now we're adding another piece of the story with sustainability. And Audi also has another story. What they're using a startup to do artificial intelligence tracking of what's going on in their supply chain and their suppliers. And if any of their they do a search of the internet and social media, if there are any alerts about something that's going on with one of their suppliers, they get information about it. So the manufacturers are trying a number of different ways of trying to keep track of what's going on in terms of sustainability. But so when it comes down to it, though, and this is something that I really want to talk about with our speakers today, some of the issues that are probably going to have to change in terms of what they're doing in terms of their supply chain and in goods movement. They're probably going to have to do better forecasting of projects. They're going to have to do more partnerships with their suppliers for forecasts and time estimates. They maybe even consider alternative products and approaches depending on what their suppliers are capable of. Maybe considering more stock. Maybe just-in-time delivery also has issues related to that. Now we've always known that in just-in-time delivery, manufacturers said, well, we don't want to carry stock, but really their suppliers were carrying a lot of stock. And we saw during the pandemic that some of the companies were able to hold on for quite a while, but not, after about 3 or 4 months, that didn't work at all. Now, companies consider reshoring and shortening their supply chain as far as a sustainability issue. They can consider more vertical integration, doing more stuff internally. And they can consider more dual sourcing for crucial components. Now, this has to do with more related to the issues of whether all the suppliers are going to be able to provide what they need. And also they may have to diversify their logistics and ports of entry. Our next and first speaker, Sina Zen. She's the Sustainable Mobility Officer and supports eco-logistics community projects at the Sustainable Mobility team at ICLEI. Her previous professional experiences include transportation consulting, policy research, and business development in the fields of electrification, automation, and shared mobility. She holds an MBA in Sustainable Mobility Management from the Technical University of Berlin and a BS in Civil Engineering from Colorado State University. Welcome, Sina.
First, thanks for having me here. Again, my name is Sina and I work for ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. And today I will be speaking mainly in like a city's perspective because we mainly work with cities and yeah. And just a quick agenda, I'll be introducing a little bit about ICLE and then the importance of ecologistics. And then an introduction of our ecologistics projects, logistics challenges, the ecologistics principles that we came up with, and then some city examples of what's going on in some of our network cities. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability, and we're a global network working with more than 2,500 local and regional governments committed to sustainable urban development in various regions. And globally, we have 24 regional and country offices. We're active in 125 countries. We influence sustainable policy and drive local action for low emission, nature-based, equitable, resilient, and circular development. And transport is a cross-cutting theme across all these pathways. So I think most of our audience is based in the US. Here's a map of our offices, and our USA office is located in Denver. So just to set the scene, why are we talking about ecologistics? So as you can see from this slide, 25% of traffic in European cities are freight related, but occupy about 40% of road space, and 25% of transport related emissions, and 30 to 50% transport related air pollutants. Similarly, if we look at global numbers, urban freight represents up to 25% of urban vehicles, takes up to 40% of motorized road space, and same about 40% of urban transport related CO2 emissions. So the industry's environmental impact is only set to increase further as global freight demand is estimated to triple between 2015 and 2050. So this growth presents many unique urban challenges, including, you see in the left, congestion, air pollution, traffic accidents, among others. Freight is the backbone of many cities' economies, which we need to start thinking about it in a more sustainable way. Because in city planning for the longest time, when we think of mobility, we only focus on passenger transport, but freight is equally as important and is slowly gaining more traction thanks to technology and the rise of e-commerce. At the same time, as Bruce mentioned earlier, like COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of logistics operations, brings us goods and disruptions from the freight sector. So from Europe to US and China, you can see transport companies are recording record volumes of traffic, and cities, in the city's perspective, even though passenger transport went down, air quality remains the same. So that's because of the rise of freight transport. And so at ICLE, we coined the term ecologistics. So ecologistics promotes transportation of goods by giving priority to health, safety, low emission, and urban development. Encourages circular regional economies while limiting the impact of freight transport. So through ecologistics, we want to transform urban logistics scenes in cities through effective regulatory planning and administrative instruments at all levels of government. And you can learn more about our ecologistics initiative on this link on this site, sustainablemobility.icle.org. And ecologistics initiative. Our sustainable mobility team, we have two ecologistics initiatives. So the first one is the ecologistics community. As mentioned earlier, freight has been overlooked in terms of mobility planning. We see a lot of interest in cities in having a standalone like freight planning, but then since freight isn't really a big, it's kind of like new in terms of doing planning for that. So there's a lot of capacity building to be done and best practices to learn. So in a nutshell, the ecologistics community is the first global network, among the first global network on sustainable urban logistics. So the community aims to be a global platform for highly committed cities and expert organizations in advocating and driving sustainable urban logistics in cities and at an international stage. So the community supports local governments to enhance innovative capacity, real actions, and sustainable urban logistics. So we do that by collaborative exchanges. We do peer exchanges with cities to share best practices. We have tools and resources online on our website for cities to use, and then capacity building, figure out what topics are needed, like low emission zones or like urban logistic trends, and help capacitate cities and facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogues within the city. And then another project that we have is the IKI Ecologistics. The project is supported by the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature, Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, a lot of known as BMU. I don't know how that works, but through the International Climate Initiative, which is abbreviated as IKI. It is currently implemented across 9 cities in Colombia, Argentina, and India. The project focuses on capacitating government and non-governmental actors to build strategies and policies to promote low carbon and more sustainable urban freight in the urban areas, to implement demonstration projects and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in cities. So our role is just project management and coordination, and we have multiple partnering organizations in the field of freight that provide the technical expertise that our cities need. So that includes the Smart Freight Center, which you will hear about later. Rick will be talking about them, their work. What are cities trying to do, and like what are the outcomes? What are they aiming for? Globally, we're dealing with climate change from carbon emissions and emphasis on air quality in cities. So within this project, we have 3 layers into that, including like baseline setting. We need to figure out, and within each city context, figure out who all the stakeholders are, and then form a group in terms of like figuring out what data we need in freight, based on what the city plans to achieve. And then from there to measure emissions, because then you want it to measure progress every year. And from all the baseline setting to drive real change, we have to make an action plan. We're working with cities in developing low carbon action plans for urban freight, or some of you might know it as sustainable urban logistic plan or a freight plan. They're all pretty similar in terms of helping in implementing demonstration of pilot projects and with policy strategies and recommendations specific towards the city's vision and goal. And then through it all, global outreach, we share best practices from different cities and learnings so that other cities and local governments could take inspiration from it. So there are many challenges in freight planning, and they're all pretty similar. There's a lack of discussion on urban freight. It's not something that's been talked about a lot, and like it's gaining traction, so that's a good thing. And then data availability is also lacking, and figuring out what data that needs and what data the city needs, and then also getting it from the private sector is also a difficulty, because sometimes there is this whole trust in sharing data. And then urban freight is complex. It's a fragmented sector, and there are a range of stakeholders with different priorities. You have the shippers, receivers, transport operators in cities. So there's like a lack of alignment. So it's quite like a journey of like having stakeholders all together, and it's an iterative process. It goes on, and there's no like one meeting and you could figure out everything. So yeah, and then there's also factors in such as new technologies, and that increases expectation in terms of delivery performance and the use of road space. So causing cities to look for solutions in how to manage the curb, because that's the most one of the most important assets city have is their curb spacing. So on that, some strategies, like clear strategies that links transport and land use together. So we look at land use planning and modal shift interventions, such as like in technology and policy. And so things such as like clean vehicle technology and fuel structure, implementing low emission zones or like off-peak deliveries. There's multiple different strategies that cities could implement based on how their own city environment. And then, but one of the biggest thing, collaboration is key. And based on all that, in October 2020, we launched the Ecologistics Principle, the low emission urban freight for sustainable cities that local governments can follow to lead the transition to sustainable urban freight for livable cities. And this is just to help cities to figure out how they could collaborate better with stakeholders, what kind of technologies they could look into, policies and land use planning. So for example, sustainable delivery options using non-motorized vehicles and electric vans if you can improve efficiency and sustainability and performance of urban freight. And then integrating freight into land use planning can ensure that deliveries are planned into development from the start. So yes, if you're interested to learn more about the 8 principles, we have a nice little video that's 3 minutes long. You could check it out on our website as well. So one of the things that was been mentioned a lot is stakeholders are critical in terms of planning. And so we always encourage our cities to do a multi-stakeholder analysis first and figure out who are your stakeholders and try to involve all the interesting parties, whether it's business operators, local residents, unions, and academics, because they're the one that has a lot of knowledge in terms of new technologies and how they impact the cities. And then, so here are just some of like examples of like our network cities and what they're doing. So Taoyuan City in Taiwan is actually the chair city for our ecologistics community, and they are implementing 5 demonstration projects in Taoyuan, which focuses in like smart logistics, low carbon transportation, air pollution management, and green buildings. They're done over 30 stakeholder meetings to figure out what is it that the city needs and the residents need, and how to make urban logistics more sustainable, environmental friendly. Some of the big things is like low emission fleets, of replacing diesel cars, and then implementing a low emission zone in certain parts of the Old Town district. And then they're also tackling warehousing as well, how to make it more efficient and sustainable, automating it. And they're also working on a sustainable urban logistics plan that should be out in May, and talking about what strategies they're going to use in terms of making their urban logistics more sustainable. And then another example we have is in Bogota, Colombia. We are working with them in producing a low carbon action plan. And there are 4 pillars to Bogota's LCAP, as we call it. First pillar is in technological change, like to promote the use of more efficient and clean fleets. Second pillar is the urban freight traffic definition, like building the vision and planning of urban freight based on sustainable criteria and how to improve urban mobility in their city. Third is optimizing infrastructure use to promote efficiency. And the fourth pillar is communication, just the sharing of best practices, new technology development, capacity building, and continuous stakeholder engagement. And then an example of what demonstration project or pilot project Bogota doing is to how to evaluate deconsolidation alternatives using zero emission vehicles for the last mile delivery or packages. And the goal is to transform more than 40% of cargo activity in vehicles smaller than 3.5 tons. So I think I forgot to mention earlier, one of the biggest challenges is the last mile delivery. And so many of the projects that cities are working on are specifically targeting last mile logistics. Another example we have is in Barcelona, Spain. There's a use of mix of like sticks and carrots approach, as you call it. Low emission zones. Barcelona's low emission zone like came into force last year and for private vehicles, and they also applied it to freight transport. Hence, the alternative delivery method is very important here. LAZ is part of a range of actions to reduce the city's air pollutant emissions by 30% in the next 15 years and to promote alternative modes of transport. Barcelona is also a trailblazer and strong proponent in cyclo-logistics. So they also partner with cycle-logistics providers and provide public grants and work with them in app development to and also figuring out different areas where they could put in urban logistics hubs. So then to use cycle-logistics for the last mile delivery and hoping. And they've been expanding all this into different areas across Barcelona, and cycle-logistics has been a very popular pilot project for many cities in terms of tackling the last mile. And then one closer to home here in the US is Portland, Oregon. I would consider Portland has been like a trailblazer in freight development, and they are currently working on their 2040 Portland Freight Plan, and it is an update to the city's 2006 Freight Master Plan. So this plan will provide a strategic roadmap for investing in urban freight infrastructure. It supports the city's advancement in Vision Zero and to recognize trends in the supply and distribution of goods. And the planning process is guided by two fundamental questions from PBOT. One of them is, will it advance equity and address structural racism? And the second one is like reducing carbon emissions. In terms of potential strategies, you could look into infrastructure and technology investments, monitoring greenhouse gas mitigation, collaborative work, funding and incentives and regulations. So policy recommendations include using clean technology, incentivizing the use of clean vehicle and fuel efficient technologies, and fuel infrastructure subsidies, support and expand pilot programs and emerging technologies, so including like off-peak deliveries, parking pricing, and delivery lockers. Also looking into other emerging technology and last mile, such as e-bikes, delivery robots, and drones. So I think a lot of the cities all have something in common in terms of tackling the last mile, but also kind of gearing towards more of that clean vehicle for the last mile instead of having your big polluting trucks going into your city, trying to encourage more light vehicles with low emission to have more efficient deliveries, but also be more safe for your inner city roads. So with all of that, if you want to learn more about like ecologistics and freight, we have a bunch of knowledge products in our website in terms of like self-monitoring tool, how to calculate emissions and what's going on in different cities. And if you're interested, there's our website, sustainability.eclay.org, and that's all I have for today. So if you have any questions, happy to answer it. And thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Sina. Sina, one of the things that struck me was when you look at the projects that you've been working on, are there certain areas that you consider that seem to go across all the cities from, I guess you would call it low-hanging fruit, and some of the things that seem to be easier to implement in all the cities?
So I think that was one of the things I discussed was in the last mile delivery. And what
Yeah.
we've seen is that most cities, the low hanging fruit would be um, psychologists and urban consolidation centers. We've seen like most of our city network has been doing starting pilot projects or already have pilot projects in using psychologistics and having this consolidation center in the right by the urban core or in the urban core where you just have all your deliveries in this little hub and then you use bicycles to deliver all that, or you can also use mini delivery vans. So I think, yeah, especially because there's not a lot of spacing in densely populated cities. So
Right. So this is something that they've been dealing with for decades, probably, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was just gonna say, psychologistics isn't something new. It's been around. It's kind of just like a revival of the old method.
Yeah. When you think about one of the things that was talked about the last time we looked at goods movement was, I think, our 2016 conference, and we had a speaker who had a company that was making it easier for other companies to come together to ship maybe either long distances or short distances together, so that you had full loads rather than partial loads in your trucks. For urban deliveries, how successful have you guys been in getting companies to consolidate their deliveries within the urban settings?
So it's still a process. I think one of those is like talking to multiple different operators is kind of getting them on board is one of the biggest hurdles too. And I think it is the whole thing about multi-stakeholder engagement is to kind of having that dialogue with different operators and getting to know that having this process together isn't is going to help them too, how it'd be more efficient in terms of for their own operations and not just for the good of the city. And then one thing that's interesting too in Baden-Württemberg, we have this thing called a logic channel. It's like you're using it's kind of integrating passenger transport and urban freight in the tram. And so there's also like different things to look at, not just in terms of like operators, but also integrating with passenger transport and freight transport together.
I see we got a question from Nathan. Nathan, do you want to ask the question?
Happy to. Yeah. So I was just curious, when you're talking at the state or the city level, if there's any funding that we're seeing from the American Rescue Plan, because those states are able to define how they spend their dollars, if any of that's being allocated towards ecologistics. I'm aware there's very little in the infrastructure plan that was passed at the federal level by Build Back Better's stalled. So didn't know if you've seen anything in American Rescue Plan that's able to usher this forward.
That's actually a really good question. I don't know. Most of the cities we work with is actually in the global south, and Portland is a special case in our network. And I would be curious to look into that as well and trying to get more American cities on board as well. So thanks for telling me about this.
Yeah, Sina, one of the things that struck me, and we've in your presentation, you're talking about the data collection as kind of a weakness and a strength at the same time. How do you overcome the data collection story?
That definitely is the biggest hurdle. And so Taiwan City, our host city, who's been just as an example, we came up with a bunch of this thing called the ecologistics indicators. So certain like data to look for in terms of they're going to ask certain operators just to set up their baseline. And out of all, I think they reach out to about 30 or more operators, and only about 5 surveys came back. So there is, I think, I mean, it's still kind of, but then the thing is that they did went through and it has a mix of, you know, bigger operators and smaller operators. So it's kind of representative. 5 is still better than nothing, but it's the hard part about not getting feedback. But then yet again, when they reach out to the operators again and ask what is it that they could do to help them fill out the survey, a lot of it is that like they don't understand some of the questions, and like they also don't understand like how, like where to get the data for them. They actually, a lot of them do feel like they want to participate and work with the city, but it is that they so now we're working with them in how to make this survey more understandable and so that it'll be, and condense it so that it'll be more like simplified for the operators to share some of the information, and also having like maybe a training course on how to understand it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you can, as you can see, tell from that story, a lot of it has to do with how you're asking the questions, right? And and outreach. And I think that one of the issues that that you talked about is getting all the stakeholders together at one time. You know, I think I've seen from other projects, and Rick and Nathan, you could talk about this as well, that when you have all the many of the stakeholders in the room, you can have an honest discussion about how you're going to approach this, ways that you're going to help them actually help their businesses as well as helping the city. Is that something that you find as well to be a key to being successful in these projects?
Yeah, Bruce, and then thanks for the question. I think it's an absolute must, effectively. And what we see even more is that you can't, any of these kind of solutions you can't do on your own. And you've seen that the supply chains have become so complex. If we talk about the urban consolidation of this, it's even you need to work with your competitors effectively, to consolidate your matters. And it's not just about you working directly with your carrier that you contract. You need to work with your guys. That normally are your competitors, but have the shop next door.
How do you overcome that competition story?
Well, maybe Nathan has a good answer to that one, but there are many different elements there to that.
I'd say the nice thing about this is it's not a zero-sum game, right? There's actually win-wins that exist within the different stakeholders and even competitors to be able to release some of the constraints that exist in the system today, and therefore the economics of everyone improves. And finding those win-wins and starting there to be able to build trust, to be able to build momentum is incredibly important.
Yeah. Sina, how do you feel about that?
I agree with both of them. And I think it's just kind of giving that narrative that we're helping you and not harming you in any way in your operations. So. Yeah.
And finding the win-win pieces, right? That's becomes and that's a challenge, though, you know, when maybe, you know, if you've been doing this for a while, you can start using examples of, you know, we had this other city and we had these other businesses, and, you know, businesses were pretty resistant at the beginning, but we started talking to them about how this could improve how they're delivering, making their deliveries, making it easier or faster for them. So that I think usually, obviously, demonstration projects are very helpful for you in terms of proving out what your suggestions are where they're heading, right?
Yeah, I think there is this misconception with private sector thinking that if they share data or being cooperative, sometimes it might hurt them because like cities might impose some policies that aren't really good for their business, but at the end of the day, it's just working together to make the customers happy and also the city. Everything.
And also to just come in here one second in that sense is that we see quite a bit the resistance also lowering by the multinationals, in that sense that we work with, the ones that want to reach the final customers, simply because they realize that they can't do it alone. And even when there is not necessarily a win-win situation directly, they still see the benefits because they really struggle to meet the decarbonization targets, and are willing to invest accordingly to make that achievement.
Very good.
If it's not yet imposed by the cities, which is a completely different ball game accordingly.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story, right? Right.
Yeah.
Sina, and you probably have run into that too, right? Where some cities are just going to impose regulations that the companies are going to have to adjust to, and your programs can actually help them do that, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big thing about the multi-stakeholder collaborative environment is there won't be a situation where you're all going to be happy, but at least meet in the middle ground.
Yeah, very good. Okay, Sina, thank you very much for your presentation, and please stick around if you can to kibitz with Rick and Nathan's presentations. Let's go on to our next speaker, Rick Ahrens. He's the program director at Smart Freight Center, a global NGO dedicated to reduce logistics emissions. They set the standard for calculating and reporting GHG emissions from logistics and provide the directions for how to take action and reduce logistics GHG emissions. Rick leads the development of several programs, including the Low Emission Fuels and Vehicles Program and the Data Access and Exchange Program, working with multinational corporations and associations to decarbonize logistics. Rick is a trained engineer, trained as a civil engineer, and has 10 plus years experience in sustainable transport in Europe and the Global South. Welcome, Rick.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bruce. Thanks for this warm welcome here. Glad to be here.
You want to share your screen?
Yeah, I was just setting it up effectively. Well, I guess that should do it, isn't it?
It's there.
That's perfect. Yeah. So welcome everyone, and it's a pleasure to talk to you here in the next 20-25 minutes about driving decarbonization in the logistics sector. And it's a real pleasure to discuss this particular subject. And I wanted to give you kind of two takeaways at the end of this particular presentation, which is one is the urgency of decarbonizing logistics, and we've just seen from Sina already about the complexities in the urban sphere. However, it's also on a global sphere, we see this challenge, and it's a growing challenge in that sense to get that decarbonization there. But we believe at Smart Freight Center that there are 4 steps to actually reduce those logistics emissions, and I'll share those with you today, and hopefully give a small example also how that can be done in the automotive sector in Europe. Unfortunately, I didn't find a good example yet for the US, but definitely sharing the one here from Europe. As already introduced, I'm Rick Ahrens. I'm program director at Smart Freight Center, and lead several of our programs. And what we do at Smart Freight Center is really guide the global logistics industry to track and reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And we've set a really ambitious target here with 1 billion tons of CO2e. And we know that this is, of course, we as an organization alone cannot achieve this, but this is absolutely the one to get to meet and stay in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. How we do this, actually, we work across 3 different areas at Smart Freight Center. One thing which we're really keen and have been developing over the years is to drive transparency and set the standard. So really, we've been able to set the standard. How do you baseline and calculate and quantify your greenhouse gas emissions? And that will enable you further to actually take action and to be able to kind of set those decarbonization efforts and strategies on your way to get to net zero in 2050 or earlier. But one thing which is really also a second step here is that we need to facilitate the solution pathways, and because so many different directions can be taken to actually reduce your emission from logistics operations. And one of those critical elements there is that we've just been talking about this, of course, already in the short panel discussion we just had about catalyzing that collaboration. And we see this actually taking place much more, and increasingly also companies become aware, ranging from the smaller companies to the major companies, that they need to work together to share that knowledge, but also act together in terms of combining loads and reducing their empty miles accordingly. And we do a final step here is actually we train organizations, and we have a series of training programs running at Smart Freight Center, including that we also work with selected national governments to influence and scale up some of the activities here. But the principal focus that how we kind of achieve our impact is that we work with the global multinationals, because we really believe that those global multinationals hold the key to decarbonize logistics, because they actually the ones that ship goods across the world. There's virtually no ship in the world that doesn't carry anything from, say, an Amazon, or doesn't carry anything from is being shipped by even Volkswagen or PepsiCo. There's so many products that they sell across the world that we see in this in logistics, and that they hold this kind of power to really decarbonize accordingly. And these are just a selection of our members to the Global Logistics Emissions Council that we run at Smart Freight Center accordingly. If we then look at what these companies are faced at and how they actually look at their supply chains and their logistics operations, we see that there are actually three trends that actually exacerbate the problem as we go forward. And the one is the globalization, and we've been talking about some of those activities here, which is and leads also to the e-commerce directions, the urbanization. There's more demand for logistics. The delivery, the COVID pandemic has just accelerated the urban delivery models, and therefore also increasing the number of logistics, but also the need for this resilience accordingly, and the risks associated with it. Then the second element to it is this digitalization and the problems that we see facing on that. We see that organizations are willing and investing in digitalization, but they also struggle actually, because they don't hold all of the information, and they also struggle in terms of actually matching that information, making that to tangible decision-making options for them. And then thirdly, this is the absolute core that we see, and is that they want to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement. They've set ambitious targets accordingly, so to reach 50% reductions by 2030, or become net zero already by 2040. But they don't really know yet how they are actually doing this. And this is increasingly becoming important as we go forward. And to give you a scale of and a more magnitude of the problem, we always have this one particular slide where we say the urgency. And the urgency is just, I think, how you can show it here, because if we talk about the world, nearly 4 billion tons of CO2e emerging from logistics operations, and it's going to grow to 5.5 billion. So it's increasing by 42% in the coming years, whilst we are actually intending to get to net zero by 2050, at least within many European countries. The European Union has set net zero by 2050. The US has set net zero by 2050. China is saying by 2060. So we're looking at the major economies that are really looking to get to net zero. And at the same time, we know that logistics emissions are increasing. And if we then look at where those days actually come from, the majority comes from road freight, as well as from urban delivery. So that's the majority of those emissions that take place. And then only to a smaller extent, but increasingly becoming important, are the marine sector and the aviation sector, simply because they are emitting, they are like growing as a volume, and the technologies and the pathways to zero emission are yet to really kind of to figure out how that exactly goes in moving forward. And then just to show you also where does that demand come from, we see that the freight demand is actually set to triple in the next year. So we're not even at the peak of our logistics operations here. We're really increasing the number of freight and the demand for freight in billion ton kilometers here that you can see in the moving years. And the biggest demand increase will come from the sea freight effectively as we go forward, which is the big kind of ships going across the oceans to travel and bring logistics goods across the world. But if we then look at how those trajectories go forward, and we see the differences here from what happens in 2015 and the projections where we go in 2050, even with the best scenarios that are currently being scheduled, is that we can't meet the reduction targets by 2030 or even by 2050 to meet with the 1.5 degree scenarios. And that's still like a real challenge here, that we need to scale up our action accordingly. So it's kind of a call for action for everyone, but luckily, at least we know that there's a series of organizations really willing to invest in this. And then maybe one final one about the numbers before I would go into kind of how do you get there and how do we get to their solutions as we go forward, is just this example of how logistics has changed over the years and how this globalization processes that I talked about at the beginning really occurred. And what you see here is the average distance of a supply chain link. So how far did a single link in the supply chain travel? And if we see this in the UK, that increased from 36 kilometers in the 50s to around 100 kilometers in 2018, as you can see here on the graphic. In China, that same acceleration, it increased from 11 kilometers to 182 kilometers on average. So imagine that just this increase in distance, so the distance that any product needs to move before it gets to kind of the next part of the supply chain, shows also the increase in demand, but also the increased complexity of actually, because every increase in demand will also increase your emissions effectively, unless you're running on zero emission technologies yet. But a lot of this is running on ordinary diesel for road freight, for instance, and every kilometer you drive extra, you emit more emissions accordingly. And we see this even, this kind of change in average length is not going to change in the near future. And we see this happening because of the wider sourcing of supplies, the greater centralization of production and inventory. So we see bigger facilities taking place. And at the same time, we see there's a lot of talk has been taking place about this nearshoring or reshoring of activities. And although this has been on the minds of many, we don't see it yet happen too much, simply because also the costs have been quite high, and it's not always been a better solution there, simply because of where the product's origin come from. So where does the raw materials come from, and how do you actually make that reduction as overall? Now, moving kind of beyond, like to show you this urgency, and then moving beyond this, we see that there are 4 steps to actually decarbonize your logistics. And the first one is always to understand where do you come from. So where are you standing, and to baseline your emissions from your multimodal supply chain. Secondly, to go towards like setting your targets, reduce your emissions, and make sure that they are aligned with the Science-Based Targets initiatives, or in line with the Paris Agreement at least. And then third step is, of course, once you know where you stand and where you want to go, take those actions and reduce those emissions by implementing them. And most of the solutions you can't implement just alone. You actually need to collaborate with that to take action as a sector, as a whole, and make that a reality. And I'll run you through quickly through some of those steps here as we go forward. To the first step in terms of baselining your logistics emissions, and is actually calculate your logistics emissions. And how do we do this? That's where the Black framework has been established. And this is the only globally recognized methodology to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. And what the idea behind this is that you are able to capture all of the emissions consistently, and also be made responsible for all of the emissions that do occur in your logistics operations. And it's now actually recognized by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, by CDP, and used by 170 multinationals globally, including the leading ones that I've just shown you earlier in the graphic as we go. And what does that mean to actually calculate your logistics emissions? First of all, you need to think about all of the modes that you talk about. So not just about road freight, but also talk about the rail, air, inland waterways, logistics side, as well as the sea side of things, and cover all of those. Then secondly, and Bruce talked about this at the beginning, is to think about your total scope of your emissions. So it's not just the emissions that you are directly responsible for. So the emissions from your own vehicles or your own operations, it's also your electricity consumption there, but in particularly your scope 3 emissions, because as an organization, you are responsible or made responsible also to ship those goods across. And even though it's being shipped by someone else, maybe a UPS or DHL or someone else, you are responsible for that kind of shipment taking place, and that's where your scope 3 emissions come into place, and which are for many organizations maybe 90 to 100% of their total emissions taking place. Then going to the bottom right, we also need to become kind of mindful of the full life cycle. So it's not just the combustion of the fuel that you do at the point of kind of at the engine within your ship or the car that you burn, but it's also the production and the distribution of that network. And this becomes increasingly more important if we talk, for instance, about hydrogen. How that hydrogen was that produced and where did the distribute come from? So to understand that of biofuels is a similar, where did the biofuel come from before we actually understand, do we truly reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Because you need to cover all of the greenhouse gas emissions, and Bruce showed you all of which ones they are, and they're shown here on the slide as well. They're not a local air pollutant. They travel all over the world, and it matters immediately where your greenhouse gas emissions are. So we really need to think about all of the modes. We need to think about all of the 3 scopes, be mindful of the well-to-wheel emissions, so the combustion and the production and distribution of your emission, and make sure that we cover all of the greenhouse gas emissions, and not just, for instance, carbon dioxide, but also like methane or NOx, the silver NOx oxide accordingly. Now, to be very practical, and we like to be practical at Smart Freight Center in that sense, to really deliver some of those solutions as you go forward, is to think about the 4 steps towards calculations, your emissions. And first and foremost is you need to think about the collection of the data that you have, but also make then second step is to make the calculation. We can show you how it should be done in details, but the second step is to really make the calculation accordingly, verify that calculation as well. So it's not just a quick one to say, look, it's A times B. Make sure that you actually cover also the concepts of empty running. Make sure that you consider the loading factors accordingly, to really make sure the calculation is valid and that you've made a correct calculation here. And then, of course, report and disclose your emissions, because that will only help you to kind of trigger action to move forward. And then the second step, and if you go back to the 4th step, so now you have your baseline understanding of where emissions come from, is to set your targets. And then there are always 2 critical targets that we believe, and you should be setting accordingly, which is the first of all is calculate your total emissions as you go forward. And secondly, is your emission intensity. So this is the relative emissions per ton kilometer, like per moved good, or actually, because that's a real able to compare apples to apples if you talk about the emission intensity versus the total emissions, which is the ultimate objective, of course, to get those down. However, you can also think about smaller targets or like performance indicators that work for specific parts of your supply chain. And I've shared a few examples here. For instance, IKEA sets the number of electric truck deliveries that they can do within their cities, or the number of fleets that you have with an alternative fuel or zero emission fuels as you go forward. Then finally, we're moving kind of having set your targets here. And I know that I'm just broad brushing here on some of the bigger solutions, but I'll show you then some of the solutions as we go forward and how you collaborate there. We believe that it's not just only talking about the what we sometimes call the shiny objects. It's not only about talking about zero emission technology and buying this latest truck or the latest electric vehicle from the market. It's also making sure that you cover all of the solutions that are on the left. So manage the growth of your demand. Are you able to optimize your supply chain network? And I'll give you an example here in a minute from how that's done in the logistics industry, in the automotive industry in Europe. Make sure that you actually combine modes. And this is also why you've seen at the beginning how sea freight is actually going to increase, because it simply can carry so much freight in one single ship, that using a sea freight is much more better and much more optimal in comparison to, for instance, using road freight directly or using aviation by definition. And then the third and fourth solution, which are critical to really decarbonize logistics, are making sure that you actually use and share those vehicles to the maximum possible, so that we don't have a half empty trucks running, or that you actually, for every delivery that there's the truck returns empty accordingly, but maybe you can actually find a return load accordingly. And then fourthly, there's simple solutions which make just also common business sense to actually use your energy, use energy efficient vehicles. So for instance, you can train your drivers to drive slightly slower, or use slow steaming, but you can also use more efficient vehicles and aerodynamic solutions here, which are already reducing your emissions without too big investments, which are of course the ultimate solution that's needed to actually invest in your, like, switching energy sources to a hydrogen or green hydrogen or electric vehicles accordingly as we go. And I just wanted to give you one example here of how that looks like in terms of a logistics operations here. And this is an example that I've been able to borrow from Inform. And this is from the automotive brands that operate on an individual basis about their outbound and inbound logistics flows. And it's from the finished vehicles to the yards and the dealers. And you can see it goes right across the whole of Europe effectively with all of their networks. If you look at this further, then if all the brands are operating and you just look at the outbound logistics flows and how the volume of it behind this, the example shown here is that, for instance, there's a large significant imbalance taking place, that there's a larger flow from Germany to the UK than the flow back. And as a result of this, you create this empty running that you need. So you have trucks going from one side to the other side, from the Germany to the UK. However, they return empty. By collaborating and making maybe alternative flows, alternative solutions, you can actually reduce your emissions accordingly. Because if we look at the other side of things, if we look at the inbound solutions, are also different, but they are slightly different. And these are like, they have a different pattern, a different layout. And by matching those kind of layouts, but also ensuring that you kind of be smart about your solutions that you kind of apply. Because we know that a finished vehicle, you can't use the same trailer normally to move a container with the parts that are going to be on the inbound logistics. So there are actually solutions. And this is one of those, kind of being smart about how you use a single truck. So if you use on the cars on the way out, so you talk about your outbound logistics, you use the ordinary trailer that we have. However, on the way back, you can actually use the container and bring back the parcels that maybe come from the UK and are being assembled in Germany accordingly. A similar initiative we've seen for foldable containers here taking place. And this is just simple examples where you can be kind of smart, but also kind of optimize your optimize your supply chain already, and therefore reduce empty runnings, therefore be saving fuel, and therefore reducing your logistics operations. And finally, if you actually were to combine and work together, you can actually create a much more optimal network across the supply chains, maybe with a small distribution hub. But a single operating brand can't achieve this. So you need to collaborate and find those optimization solutions. And of course, this is not an easy one, and especially in the automotive industry, which is highly competitive, it's not an easy one. But we see this taking place much more and more often, that companies are willing to collaborate here accordingly and bring together some of their supply chains to work together. Because you can't just do it alone. You really need to work together. It's not just you, but it's also the rail company that comes to it. It's the suppliers, the OEMs, the electrical OEM that works with it, but also the FMCGs or the furniture companies that maybe are willing to have a backload to make that collaboration work. You need to kind of think about then the bundling of flows and finding those backloads and finding win-wins between those companies to actually reduce those emissions. And I wanted to give you kind of an example where we are now seeking to develop this. And we have two running initiatives, and one is really an exciting new one about the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, which is going to unite different corporate freight buyers in their efforts to actually reduce emissions. And together they can actually work to streamline some of those scalable solutions. So maybe they can adopt some of those technologies that are out there, but particularly they can also catalyze this collaboration. So we know that some of the leading organizations, and we know that partners already are Unilever and PepsiCo and Maersk, that are really looking forward to collaborate here as we go forward. And together they also invested also to show this progress towards achieving their targets to decarbonize the logistics operations. And we do this together in a wide range collaborative platform that we're currently setting up. And yeah, I would encourage you to kind of have a look at this collaborative initiative that we're currently setting up of the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance. And something similar already existed and is part of kind of where you see how organizations come willingly together to understand and drive down their emissions in the marine industry and the container industry and the sea freight, where different shippers, freight forwards, and their carriers all came together to actually reduce their emissions and to actually report first of all their emissions, set a common target accordingly, and collaborate to kind of reduce their emissions. So to sum it all up, and then kind of wrap it up in very 4 quick steps that we've kind of outlined here. And going back to the 4 original steps, assess your logistics emissions, calculate them. Is it measured? Can those be shared with you? Use the GLEC framework as the methodology here accordingly. Set your targets and assess those targets as well from your supply chains and your partners that you work with to actually reduce their logistics emissions. Translate them also to internal KPIs beyond just the targets that you have set. Assess all of the 5 solution areas that we've just been talking about this, and work across all of the modes, but also in terms of a multimodal supply chain to be able to restructure or reduce your emissions directly. Talking about not just about the shiny objects, as we say, like only in zero emission technologies, but also about restructuring some of the other solutions here. And finally, actually work across and engage with your supply chain on those sustainability strategies and initiatives. Join, for instance, such as Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, but also work with your supply chain and see what they can do to actually decarbonize your logistics operations. And this was a very nutshell story that I wanted to share with you here today. If you're interested to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me or any of our team at Smart Freight Center. And it's a pleasure to discuss further our decarbonization strategy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rick. Very good presentation. Thank you very much. A lot of really good information there. And want to bring our other speakers in here to get them involved here in the question and answer section here. Now, Rick, the thing that jumps out at me is that obviously you guys have been working on life cycle analysis, and because that's how things got. When you start looking at all the issues that you're looking at, it's really complicated, right? And it's to being able to do all the measurements that you're talking about across supply chains, across different modes of transportation. It's significant. How far along are you guys in kind of setting up, I guess maybe easier ways for companies to actually get these measurements that they need?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to be perfectly honest, we don't do any LCAs. We don't do life cycle analysis. Mm-hmm. It's actually, we build upon there are excellent researchers out there in the world that do perfect LCAs. Yeah. What we have been able to do, and that's what really what we do at Smart Freight Center, is to unite these different organizations to come kind of and work together on standardizing these kind of methodologies. So if you use the GLEC framework, and we try to we know it's very complex, and at the same time, we try to make things simple. So if we look at the GLEC framework, the calculation is not too complex. You need your number of ton kilometers. So you need to know what's the weight of the volume and so that you've been moving around and how far did it move. And then you can use the standard factors from the GLEC framework to actually calculate your greenhouse gas footprint already.
So you're basing it on work that you guys have already done and other people have already done. as kind of the background that companies can use to get things going, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you can advance and you can go to very complex calculations using telematics and all kind of different discussions here.
Yeah.
The basic principles are staying the same and are really kind of straightforward nowadays to make those calculations.
Yeah. Do companies have to pay to be a part of your group or for your services?
No, they can the GLEC framework is you can download for free. It's open to everyone. It's not like anything else, so you can join. Of course, if you want to join the membership, etc., you do pay a little bit, but that's kind of to contribute also to the discussions that we have. For instance, if you talk about vehicle production emissions, etc., or zero emission technology.
Yeah. Nathan.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation, Rick. I had a question if you're seeing the logistics companies really commit to net zero versus reducing their ton kilometer ratio as you highlighted there in that last statement. Because there's a difference, right? As we see e-commerce really starting to take off, you can still have more emissions on a net basis versus on a per ton kilometer type of basis.
I think we see, so for instance, I know that for instance, take a Procter & Gamble, we really see them actually driving their emission intensities down by 50% to 2030, and they already be able to restructure part of the supply chain, moving some of the supply chains from road to rail, for instance. They actually reduce their emissions by 5-6%. Simply by those measures in a few years' time, and in 2030, I'm sure that they'll manage to get that. On the back of that, despite the growth then, and which they project, they are also reducing their absolute emissions. I can't disclose how many, but they are absolutely reducing that accordingly as well. Yeah. So we see most organizations doing it. Yeah.
Now, Rick, do you think that companies can actually meet 2030 goals? Are they being too overly optimistic?
I think it's a good, they can meet their targets, but they are also reliant on some of the external factors that they can't influence.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem, for instance, if you talk about Europe and the US is not any different, I think, is road freight, for instance. And decarbonizing road freight means you actually also not beyond also just optimizing the loads and efficiency measures, is to be able to buy zero emission technology trucks. And those trucks are coming to market in the next 2-3 years. We know, like for urban deliveries, they already exist, but getting them for the long haul, they're coming to market in the next couple of years. But the question is, are there enough? And can they get hold of them?
Yeah.
And I saw a fantastic article today, which was saying that in Europe, the market for 16 tons plus zero emission technology increased by 200% in 1 year.
Yeah.
And then I was looking at the actual numbers, and they were talking about like maybe 200 trucks reached the market today. If you could set that off, that we buy 12,000 trucks on an annual basis in Europe, that's of course a drip in the ocean. So it really kind of, how quickly can the OEMs ramp up their zero emission technology trucks and get them hold of?
Of course, we look at this from the automotive standpoint of the light vehicle trucks and cars and trucks, and the transition to electric vehicles from passenger vehicle, light duty vehicles is, I mean, the estimates are, maybe 6%, 8% by 2025, and then people are talking about 40% by 2030, and you go, this transition is going to take longer than people think. I think that, and heavy duty is a big challenge to be able to get zero emission heavy trucks. It's not impossible, but the transition is challenging. One of the good things about the major carriers is that they turn their vehicles over quickly, so that the major carriers, they might keep a vehicle for only 3 years. And then it'll go down into the food chain of of heavy trucks where people buy used vehicles and stuff like that. But the new ones, there's an opportunity that to put in new technology into the vehicles. Of course, price, I mean, I don't think I've ever seen an industry as tight in terms of their margins than trucking industries. And, you know, where they're battling for, you know, cents on the mile per dollar for fuel, right? And it'll determine whether they're profitable or not. It's a very challenging industry. And to bring in new technology, new vehicles that are going to be able to meet these goals, they're going to have to be well priced for them to actually, you know, justify. And so here we got lots of challenges coming up, right?
Yes, but I would challenge you also on this a little bit, Bruce, in that sense, because we've seen now, so two things which are just to give you a kind of how quickly a market can change and turn around. If you talk about passenger vehicles, and I live in the Netherlands here, and we see that I think it's 40-50% of all new sales are electric vehicles at the moment. And that's not because they are just suddenly so cheap. It's also because they are like, it's simply the direction of travel, it's the demand that's needed, and they have become much cheaper if you talk about a total cost of ownership perspective. So the actual running of an electric vehicle is so much cheaper than ordinary diesel, and with the gas prices going up rapidly, it's even more attractive. So we've seen various studies of total cost of ownership on light duty vehicles, on light commercial vehicles, that they are quite positive. On the heavy duty segment, the technology is still, is the biggest challenge. But I think I'm quite optimistic in that sense that it's going to be there in the next 2-3 years, and we see accelerated uptake of it. So, and that the OEMs can't meet the demand.
Yeah, from the light duty story, we can see that, you know, in Europe, it's regulatory issues that are pushing the manufacturers to come up with new technology, come out with these, especially in Europe's interesting because it's not necessarily pure electrics. It's like half pure electrics and half PHEVs or PNE. Plug-in hybrids.
But to be fair, I think we should kind of try to stop the talk about plug-in hybrids.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, it's
not a
good long-term plan. Yeah.
It's not a long-term plan. They combine the old technology and the new technology, so your maintenance go up. The decarbonization logistics, like they're not really meeting the targets.
Big issues. Sina, you had a question.
Yeah, speaking of the new technologies and talking about like emissions, we've been talking about electric vehicles, battery electric, but what are your thoughts? I saw hydrogen on there. What are your thoughts on like hydrogen and the use of like hydrogen vehicles for like trucking?
You want the official standpoint or the kind of personal standpoint here?
Both.
No. The hydrogen market is just a few years behind the electric market. So in terms of getting a hydrogen vehicle commercially ready, is going to take a few more years. And I believe personally that therefore the electric market is going to take off much bigger, much quicker, and will win effectively over the hydrogen market. That's also to say that the hydrogen is also, the biggest problem with hydrogen is to produce enough green hydrogen. And there are alternative solutions there. For alternative markets where the hydrogen is needed in the first instance. And the final comment on it is that we see it's going to be a niche market. So it's going to be only for selected long haul, heavy duty vehicles, if it's not going to be electric, to be fair.
Yeah, very good. Nathan, you have anything to add on this story?
Support that last answer 100%. It's exactly where we see as well, long haul.
Now, Rick, you made a couple comments about reshoring and nearshoring. Can you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of, do you see it as a potential plus in meeting goals?
I think, yes, absolutely. If you are able to do it, but there are always two sides about reshoring and nearshoring in that sense. One is if you take a full life cycle analysis again, so where does the product then originally come from? So are you optimizing over the are you optimizing just over your little piece, or are you optimizing over the actual complete life cycle analysis of a particular product that you kind of consider here?
Yeah.
And then that's one of the elements here. But in principle, yes, of course, if locally can be produced and locally can be moved. I worked for a few years in Pakistan, and I had a exchange with one of the traders over there, and they were selling frozen chicken, which came out of Brazil, and it was moved to Tajikistan. And I was like, you can definitely grow chicken locally here, and you don't need to kind of move this from all the way from Brazil, import it to Pakistan, and then export it to Tajikistan.
They got a great deal,
ridiculous.
but they had a great deal, Rick.
It was cheap, probably cheaper, but yeah, from a logistics point of view, I was like, this is ridiculous.
This is the struggle that I think all companies are dealing with now. You know, well, I'm speaking more from the auto side. These companies globalized to the max. They looked for the cheapest suppliers that they could find that would meet quality targets, cost targets, delivery targets, right? And they found them throughout the world. And now they're being told, you know, this may not be the best thing for us as a world for you to do this. And they're going, now what? You know, and so how do I make judgments as a company? Okay, I can nearshore, I can go regional, you know, I can in the US, for example, I can still get good pricing by going to Mexico. I can rather than going east, going to Asia. That could be a positive, right? But there's still these, and of course, each company has to do their own thing. They have to make their own decisions, and their bottom line is going to be affected by this. How do you see that playing out when you talk to the freight sector?
To be fair, I think they struggle with the same questions as you just posed, Bruce. They're looking to kind of see the solutions. I think they see it more of a resilient solutions than than really in a decarbonizing the solution here. It's maybe a benefit to it, but I think they see it more from a resilience point of view and being less dependent on it. The biggest thing I think is going to be a bigger change also is this just-in-time market versus kind of, are you able to consolidate and therefore hold stocks and wait a little bit to be having a better load of your vehicles. Very good.
That's kind of, we're teeing up Nathan here for his presentation. He's going to be getting into some of these issues as well. So we won't step on his presentation anymore, and we'll let him tell his story. Rick, thank you very much for your presentation. Very good insight into from the freight story. Sina as well.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Nathan Neese is a partner based in the Chicago office of the Boston Consulting Group. He currently leads BCG's Center for Climate Change and Electrification in Automotive. Nathan has helped leading companies in the transportation, energy, and public sectors to create winning businesses fit for a low carbon future. His experience covers the full battery value chain, from material extraction to product integration to battery charging to the circular economy. He graduated from the University of Michigan with a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in naval architecture and marine engineering, and a master's in sustainable systems. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Bruce. And yeah, at one point I was a marine guy, but now I'm very much an automotive person. I'm thrilled to be a part of the conversation today.
There is marine. Obviously, you heard Rick talk about it.
That's right. I'm glad we covered it. Good. So as the presentation comes up, I wanted to first share that BCG is really excited to be teaming with automotive players and beyond automotive on their climate sustainability agendas. And we've also been working with organizations such as being the partners for COP26 last year, and then the World Economic Forum on a number of efforts, including the First Movers Coalition and the piece of work that I'm going to highlight today, which was titled The Net Zero Challenge, the Supply Chain Opportunity. And really strategic words chosen there. We see it as opportunity going forward, and companies increasingly seeing it as a place to create competitive advantage versus just meet regulations or see it as a downside risk. So with that, that's kind of where I wanted to start the conversation, is we see sustainability as a driver of corporate value. And it's across the number of different dimensions that when you add it up, you look at, it's a more attractive workplace. You can actually create new businesses that have higher revenues or lower costs. You manage your risks and can tell a compelling story to the investor community. As you add all these things up, it's a really compelling argument, no matter where you're at in the automotive supply chain, to have a story about how to make the transition from where you are today to a net zero future. And unsurprisingly, there's been a race of sustainability announcements within the automotive industry, most focused on what we call the downstream Scope 3 emissions of turning those ICE vehicles into battery electric. But increasingly, these same automotive players are recognizing that you can't move to a green car and still have the supply chain that's been building, or the materials that go into that vehicle, having intense emissions. And so we're seeing companies that have made commitments on reducing their CO2 within their upstream supply chain or within their Scope 1 and Scope 2 own manufacturing operations increasingly being brought to the table as well. And this is one of those examples. So whether it be your suppliers like a Bosch or a Conti, or some of the OEMs, Volvo, Mercedes, others that have made commitments first to be climate neutral on their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. That's the easiest to get into. And I'll share more as to kind of the typical abatement costs and the levers that can be pulled there. But really looking at having net zero emissions within this decade, more so at the latest than being something that's far off. Scope 3 emissions upstream, much more challenging. And that's what we'll get into as well, where there's commitments for interim targets being made. And those targets are increasingly also being accelerated. So the first announcement might say something about 20% by 2030. A year or two later, we're seeing those same companies come back and say, there's been enough advancements now to increase that target even more. And they're also setting a phase out date, whether it be 2035, 2040, some being as late as 2050 still, towards net zero, but there's a clear end date in sight as to when they will have an end-to-end fully net zero emission profiles. And so as we thought about kind of the boxes of areas that needed to be tackled, it's really all 6 on the page in order to be able to meet those Scope 1, 2, and 3 emission targets. The prior couple of presentations talked heavily about what it means to actually gain transparency and set targets. What I want to more deep dive on are the ones around reducing your own footprint, how to engage suppliers, and then enabling the organization, because there's a lot of choices that are often being made where you put the economics up against the emissions. Sometimes those align quite well, other times they don't. How do you ensure that they're given full and equal weighting at the end of the day when it comes to making investment decisions? And so we zoom out for a second and don't only talk about automotive. One of the important early findings for us was that downstream players, so those in electronics, construction, automotive, on the right-hand side of the page here, have significantly more of their emissions in their supply chains that sit within upstream Scope 3 versus what they control directly themselves. That's different than the cement, steel, mining type of companies where most of their emissions come from their own production. And so if I'm an automotive player, yes, I'm going to do something to address my own Scope 1 and Scope 2, but I really have to find an answer about how to work with those on the left-hand side of the page, since most of the inputs are going to be steel, aluminum, plastics, how to partner with them and to create a path towards ultimately seeing a zero emission supply chain. And the other thing to take into account is the upstream supply chain becomes even more important as a percentage of the total emissions of a vehicle as we move to a fully battery electric future. So this is an example of a typical car OEM, so that their mix by 2030, that's not fully battery electric, but is more battery electric. You'll see that the downstream emissions, those that come from the tailpipe, significantly reduce, while those upstream take on a higher overall percentage. And part of that is you're just reducing one whole part of that overall bar, and so therefore it moves to a different percentage. But also there is today more emissions required to produce a battery than there is an engine, and so ensuring that it's clean and instead of heavy polluting emissions to build those batteries is incredibly important going forward. So before we get back into those upstream elements, wanted to quickly highlight that scope 1 and scope 2, we see a majority of the solutions that can be done at low cost abatement levers. So the way to read this is on a euros per ton of CO2 per year on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is the amount of CO2 that you can overall reduce. We can say that there's a significant number of levers around efficiency or renewable energy that can put in play today that are going to save the company money, or be it almost a net equal amount of cost and quick payback. And so 60% of that actioning today, if you don't action that today, is actually setting yourself further behind in terms of being competitive against the other automotive manufacturers. And then there's the other elements around renewable heat measures and other aspects there that still need to be addressed, and companies are actively investing in solutions to be able to tackle those. As we look upstream, the opportunities are different, and there's not so many of those that are below the axis in terms of having a negative abatement cost, but there are still a number of them that are going to relate to low cost solutions where you can start to significantly reduce scope 3 upstream emissions today across the gamut of aluminum, steel, plastic, other elements. That's not to say that there aren't some really significant costs also on the right-hand side that are going to be part of those hard to abate sectors, and so different types of solutions and technologies need to come forward to ultimately be able to address those. So to make that come alive a little bit more, I just wanted to share a picture of what goes in a car today that maybe costs 30,000 euro. You'll see that as you strip away the margin that sits with the manufacturer or the dealer, some of the overhead, the production costs, those aspects, you're actually left with the materials of that vehicle that are closer to around 5,000 euros. So it's a relatively small portion of the overall vehicle that is the materials, which is really what creates the massive amount of emissions. And then the question we asked ourselves is, what would it take to have a net zero car? Not only one that's battery electric, but one that has green steel, other green solutions going into it. And in some ways, the shocking answer to that is it's less than 500 euros all in. So for that same car that's priced at 30,000 euro, it's less than 2% extra cost to be able to have a vehicle that had zero emissions throughout its supply chain. Now, on one lens, you might say, that's easy, $500, 2%, that's manageable. Sometimes you and I, as the buyer, might say that $500 is a lot extra to fork over and not necessarily wanting to do so. And automotive manufacturers and their suppliers spend millions and millions of dollars to try to take out $10 of cost, much less to take out $500 to maybe offset what would be this cost to be able to have a net zero car. And so there's still some important and interesting questions that need to be worked through around, does this get passed along to the consumer? How is this cost shared among the supply chain versus the automotive manufacturer? And what's ultimately going to be the right balance in order to see this come to fruition? And certainly that's going to decrease over time as we have technologies that get more to scale that are able to have green solutions come to market. What I will say though is an automotive manufacturer that's expecting to stick this $500 bill on the steel or on the aluminum players is going to have a very tough time seeing traction there, because the margin for those commodity type items is relatively small on a per ton of emissions basis, that it's really difficult for a steel player to have to raise their own cost 50 or 60% per ton of steel to be able to have a net zero solution if the automotive player is telling them that it needs to be no additional cost that gets passed on to them. So we're back to this same thing that's been raised over the prior two conversations around a multi-stakeholder type of solution that's required, where you can find the right balance. But to do it in isolation or just to throw down the hammer to the further upstream players isn't going to get much traction. And in the opening statements that Bruce made, he highlighted a few of the areas where we're already seeing automotive manufacturers or suppliers take on some of these innovative approaches. And we kind of bucketed into a few elements as to what you can do, right? So you can hardwire it into the award process. So some of the automotive manufacturers, when they have determined who's going to be able to build their batteries, have explicitly said, if you cannot give me a net zero battery, you cannot even bid on the project, much less be awarded it. So they're setting the criteria up front that those battery players need to identify sources of green electricity and other elements. Bruce highlighted the discussion around blockchain to really help create that traceability element and understand where the data is coming from. Incredibly, incredibly important to be able, you can't work on something that you don't measure. And that's what these automotive OEMs are really focusing on now, because of how it just, you might be able to know what your tier 1 suppliers are doing to a degree, but it's really hard to trace what the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are, where their emissions are coming from, other aspects, without having a conversation up and down the supply chain. There's increasingly visible lighthouse projects, those that highlighted in the middle column here, around how to get something like green steel or fossil-free steel to market. And so hybrid is one of those that has, it's a multi-stakeholder partnership again, to be able to work this technology and to have green steel solutions that are going to work for the automotive industry in the future. And then the last piece, also important, is really around enabling. So whether it be training, supplier awards, certification, different elements that give credit where credit is due and really point the arrow in a consistent and common direction for what's expected of suppliers is important to sending the signals that are needed to continue to show the right behaviors and to allow the partnerships to further thrive. And so internally, whether you be an automotive OEM, tier 1 supplier, or others, it's incredibly important to revisit the operating model for how decisions get made. Because without this, it also all falls apart. As I hinted at the opening set of statements that I made, where there's going to become a time where you're going to have to make an investment decision or business plan for the coming year, and there's going to be competing decisions. What do I invest in terms of retooling my facilities, or procurement awards that are going to be made around, do I go with lowest cost versus one that has a greener footprint? How those decisions get made in a boardroom with the right set of information and the right set of balancing discussions is incredibly important for us not to just sink back into what has always been the dominant factor, which is cost, which is not going away anytime soon. But hopefully I've highlighted over the past number of pages that there are increasingly things closer to win-wins or low-cost maneuvers that you can then, as a supplier or manufacturer, look to build back in terms of extra pricing, in terms of brand, in terms of closer relationship with your partners that have benefits that really continue to allow you to gain market share and build your business. So would not underemphasize the elements on this page that are needed to be able to action a green strategy. And I think a real shame, as we just kind of take the context of what's happening today, a shame is that most of the folks that are involved in helping bring this to life, supply chain, procurement, logistics, they're incredibly stretched given the semiconductor crisis, given the backups at ports and the strikes that are happening at the border and other things, right? So their attention is being placed elsewhere to be able to just keep the lights on. And so those folks having an opportunity or carving out time to really sit down and action the operating model is of utmost importance, and hopefully there's some relief that can be found in the near term. So I wanted to finish up with just a quick kind of view on a survey we conducted with BNP Paribas last year, where we were able to get in touch with a handful of automotive suppliers, so not the auto manufacturers, but suppliers, and ask them some really basic questions, which is, how important is ESG among your priorities? And where are you at in terms of implementing the measures? And not at all surprising, I would say, in terms of the left-hand side, where a lot of it is saying that this is a major priority for us. Also not surprising on the right-hand side, given the challenges of what it means to go action this, that many are still in the stages of developing the measures or understanding how to set a target and build an agenda versus truly feeling like they have the momentum and are systematically able to move forward. So there's a lot of work to be done. And what they cite often is it's the internal implementation effort that is the hardest element here. Less so on cost. They actually have a pretty good handle on what the requirements may be, but the commitment and carving out the time for those to be able to really action this in a meaningful way is what's proving to be the holdup. And that can't last forever, because what we then also survey asked a couple of questions, and it was the fact that to win new business, you actually have to be able to meet CO2 requirements, increasingly stringent CO2 requirements, given the example I had earlier around winning battery awards for the cell manufacturers. And those automotive OEMs have an expectation that you'll be able to fulfill those CO2 requirements soon. They're not telling you that, oh, you can wait until 2030 or 2040 before you have more of a green supply chain, but they're saying 18 months from now, I want to see meaningful progress, that what you're able to commit to, that you're putting into practice and seeing it come to life. So there's a real urgency here, that not just on setting a commitment, but being able to implement the measures that we're finding is starting to stress, particularly some of the automotive tier 1 players that find themselves in the middle of having to be responsive to the OEMs to win new business, and still struggling to maybe put together some of their own understanding of where their emissions sit, what actions that they have available. And so I just wanted to end with a similar page that I had outlined at the beginning, but to capture in a little bit more detail what some of those levers are across the boxes that we highlighted, as well as then to bring to life some of those in the other boxes as well, around actioning all of these elements to really end up with the green supply chain going forward. And it's going to be an incredible journey that is picking up momentum, but one that has still a lot of work ahead. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Very good presentation. Bringing up a lot of issues that we've already talked about today, but also a lot of neat details. I think one of the details that strikes me right away is, how'd you come up with the 500 euros? You know, there's some intense calculations, I think, going on in there, right?
That's right. It was not an easy effort. Thankfully, one that you don't need to do for every single vehicle to be able to come up with a rough number there.
Yeah.
And the majority of that $500 sits within your steel and aluminum, right? So understanding what the abatement cost is, the tons of steel that are required in a vehicle, and then being able to calculate what a green steel solution is and how that will change over time is how you can arrive at that number. And I think the surprising thing, I only focused really on that first number on that page, but it's true for every other product as well. Jeans, a bottle, a plastic bottle, whatever it is, the cost increases less than 5% in all of those cases in order to be able to end up with a net zero solution.
Yeah, that was I thought a really really insightful in terms of where the challenges really are. Did you talk about you were talking about steel and aluminum? Did you ask about lithium?
We did, and increasingly that's a focus where green supply chains within batteries are getting a ton of discussion, especially at the European level as a part of their strategy to have a more domestic supply chain and to have carbon border taxes. And the same for the US, where the BCG is involved with the LiBridge project, which is around creating a more competitive domestic supply chain here in the US as well. And it's not one that just brings more jobs or has economic competitiveness with the world, but it's around environmental and social costs. And so there's a lot of focus that's going to be being put into, you can do lithium in the more traditional way in water-starved areas where there could be a heavy either emissions or other environmental challenges, but there's increasingly process decisions that can be made around direct lithium extraction and others that will be the technologies of the future. Working with the national labs through collaborations and others, bringing those technologies to the mines that are going to get opened in the US, North America, rest of the world, are going to be ones that are going to, I think, ultimately be given more of a green light and the support that's going to be needed to help end-to-end have a green supply chain.
And you've been working on this on the battery life cycle as part of your key areas of research, right?
Yeah, there's so much interest in circular economy from every single part of the supply chain to really make it work.
Yes. Yeah. Are you seeing some good progress being made in the areas that you were just talking about? And how far along are they?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it has not been solved entirely, but right. I think there's some comfort here of it's been proven that it can be profitable, which is always important when we talk about standing up new business. If it requires consistent support from a government or other place, it's tough to create the right behaviors that are in place. And at scale recycling facilities for lithium ion batteries in China are proving profitable. And there's lead acid batteries are some of the most recycled products in the world today, and are incredibly important to creating competitive advantage for the industry there too. So like you have examples even within automotive batteries of the perfect circular economy.
Right.
The technologies about how to do recycling are advancing quickly. I'd say the fact that batteries keep changing is a challenge because you have different formats, you have different materials. How to be able to get the best yields out of those is still a work in progress. But I'd say the biggest thing is just a more consistent policy framework can really help here. Having all 50 states come up with different solutions about how to do logistics for batteries, how to trace batteries, how to recycle those is posing to be a burden that's actually hampering the industry from being able to develop a solution that helps them get to scale.
Yeah.
And then there's still the question around where the batteries are going to end up, I think, as well, right? Because does it end up at a scrapyard? And then is the scrapyard responsible for helping be the first step in determining where the batteries go? Does it end up at a dealership or a service shop where the batteries will be before they then get perhaps coordinated by a recycler or an automotive OEM who has the responsibility, or name your other party? How that shakes out for the end of life batteries needs to get solved. Coming off scrap, there's actually quite a bit of scrap coming off of battery cell manufacturing lines. That's actually the first source of allowing these recycling facilities to get up to scale and to have
Right. Yeah, very good. Rick or Sina, do you have any questions for Nathan?
Well, I was wondering in that sense, coming back to kind of some of the questions that were raised earlier, and are you seeing enough kind of production capacity in that sense as well? Are they ramping up technology here quick enough as we go forward?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And where the stress sits is in the materials, not in the cell capacity. What we've seen just over the past 6 months in terms of announcements within the US, from SK Innovation with Ford, for LG with multiple partners, with Toyota, with others, like the cell capacity is coming online quite rapidly. And the US was behind relative to Europe. That's going to be at least matching, if not in place, to help serve our battery needs in the passenger vehicle side and trucking side through 2030. The challenge is, how are those cell suppliers with the OEMs getting access to the nickel, to the lithium that takes sometimes 10, 15, 20 years to set up new mines to be able to provide these inputs that we're not ready for the surge that we've seen. I loved your example about Netherlands, where 40, 50%. Germany was a similar example where the US and Germany had a similar battery electric adoption rate back in middle 2019 of 2%. Germany at the end, the last couple months of last year, was over 30% in terms of plugins, over 15% in terms of battery electric. That's a huge acceleration that I'm not sure the upstream markets saw coming. And so to get them moving is where the race is really now on, to get your hands on certain materials, as well as to support with charging infrastructure on the back end that usually needs to be a leader, not a laggard of what's going into to driving further support for EV adoption.
Thanks. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, we always expect the volume of electrics, or especially batteries and cells. As the volume increases, the price theoretically should decrease.
Yeah.
But we're at a point right now where there could be so much demand where the cell companies or even the materials companies could say, it's going to be a little more expensive than we thought, because we have to ramp up all these capabilities so quickly. Nathan, do you see them being able to make this transition?
Yeah, we've asked this question a lot and been working with our partners on it. Is this year, there's the expectation prices will go up on lithium ion batteries for the first time in history.
Okay.
because of the near-term demand.
Yeah.
And just the supply. Long term, lithium is not a fundamentally scarce resource.
Good.
So there's certain products in there that take time to be able to bring to market, but shouldn't be scarce. And so as we ask them about their 2030, their 2035 roadmaps on $1 per kilowatt hour basis, they're still quite bullish, talking in the order of less than $75 per kilowatt hour in 2030, which then means not even just on a total cost of ownership basis, but on a purchase price parity basis. You'll see across most major markets a battery electric vehicle winning out by the end of the decade. And so that's still really encouraging, but it's not going to be a straight line that we take from where we're at today to there. There's going to be fits and starts, and there's going to be things to work through.
Yeah, and I know some of our research, we were asking experts about the comparability in pricing between an ICE vehicle and a comparable vehicle and an electric vehicle. They were thinking more like early 2030s to do that. But there's a difference with rebates or without.
That's right.
rebates,
So that goes a long way. Yes.
And that could make it, and that makes a big difference. We saw what happened in Europe in the was it early 2000s, 2020s, where the Europeans just came out with massive support for electrics. So much so that vehicles were really, really inexpensive just for a short period of time because of all the incentives that especially I think it was France and Germany in particular.
Yeah, there's a credit that came from what they leaned into COVID funding to support the EV industry.
Yeah,
it was not something that the U.S. made the strategic decision to do, and so it allowed the European automotive players to start to really action their agendas on the EV side a lot faster.
Yeah. I think Sina, did you have any questions for Nathan?
No, it's a great presentation. Still processing and all the things about the lithium battery and all. So
Yeah.
thanks for that.
And Nathan, you mentioned this. How do you? And I'd like to have you talk a little bit more about it. How do you see the sustainability issues affecting the profitability of the manufacturers and the suppliers in the near term and in the long term.
Yeah. Like anything, it's around grabbing the low-hanging fruit, which has been a common theme also from our presentations today. Right.
Yeah.
So to do it in one fell swoop is an incredible challenge. But there's a path to, like, electric vehicles have higher price points. You have certain buyers today that may be less price sensitive,
Yep.
more interested in these types of solutions around vegan leather, around clean steel, other things that they're able to give some of that demand signal initially to allow for the investments to start to take root. Because they will not be competitive. There's not enough green hydrogen, there's not enough green steel to make that green hydrogen for a number of years. So to expect that you can have a net zero vehicle today is a tough order for an OEM to think that they can put into place and have widespread customer acceptance. There are those steps that are being taken. You see more and more on leather, you see more and more on recycled plastic, you see more and more moves on circular economy in general, that those are things that are being systematically put in place that you can get the wins on the board. Green electricity from battery suppliers. I'll use Northvolt as an example because they're one of the best in terms of marketing the green battery that they're trying to bring to market. Is they've been extremely thoughtful on every step of their process for what they're sourcing and how they're building these batteries to have the lowest cost, or a still competitive cost, but with a very low emissions battery in place. That those are products that are going to be built and in vehicles here in the coming years. They're not having to make the same level of trade-offs that you might have to expect once you get into the hardest to abate technologies around aluminum, steel, and other pieces.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me in your presentation was that when your survey with your suppliers didn't make it sound like the tier 2 supply base is going to be that big a deal for them to handle. Were you surprised by that as much as I was? Yes,
I think the automotive manufacturers are scared that there's not they don't have enough clarity on a tier 2.
Yeah.
Some of the tier 1s are quite sophisticated, right? These are similar size revenues and experience as any of the automotive manufacturers. So they might have a better handle on it. But there's a lot of tier 2, tier 3 players that sit in parts of the world and with certain products that you have no idea what's going into that. And to be able to not just even trace it, but to be able to ask the right questions to build a fact base.
In the right language.
In the right language. And then to have the playbook that can solve each one of those aspects that's conditional upon the operating circumstances that they're building those products. That's a heroic task in many ways.
Yeah.
That's going to be the slowest part of this that gets built. And it's going to take experience. It's going to take surveys initially of your supplier base to start to get information back, to be able to build the repository, to engage in the conversations and have an iterative set of loops to ultimately get to a place that allows the lowest cost solutions and the ones that are going to have the best, or the best bang for your buck to be able to put in place. Yeah,
it's scary when you see VW with 13,000 suppliers. You know, that number is a big number. I mean, they're used to dealing in big numbers, but being able sending out 13,000 surveys and then somebody managing all that stuff, right? And it's going to be and this is every manufacturer doing this. Every manufacturer sorting out, well, where are we going to make where do we really need to push? Where do we need to? And as you suggest, material suppliers, and there now you're in a tier 3, right? Though I mean, from our experience, the material suppliers sometimes have direct communications with the manufacturers because the manufacturers make large scale purchases for metals in particular that they then pass on the discounts onto their supply base, right?
Correct.
So the manufacturers have a little more leverage, I think, with the material suppliers than some of the tier two suppliers.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe 2 comments on that, right? Is totally agree with it. And you have visibility, but can a material supplier action it and not be uncompetitive is the challenge where it's more of a coalition problem to be able to bring green steel to market at scale.
Yeah.
And then on the tier 2 suppliers, I think if there's kind of any blessing that's come out of COVID here for the automotive suppliers is it was an important lesson for them to recognize that supply chain resilience, when all the lockdowns happened and they realized that how much of their tier 2 suppliers were in one province in China, like they had no awareness to that. And so when they all shut down and everyone was unable to produce vehicles and everything else, it was a huge wake-up call that we need to start to build an understanding of our supply chain beyond just the just-in-time questions we might have for our tier 1 suppliers. And so they've been on this journey now for multiple years in a different lens, but now able to add the sustainability piece on top of it, that I think has been, again, a saving grace, if you will, from the other challenges they're experiencing.
Yeah, I know the Japanese and some American companies were stuck when Japan had the tsunami in 2011.
Yes.
And there was one company that got engulfed, and it shut down some of the major manufacturers. I think it was they have a certain kind of paint or paint additive that they were the only company in the world that did this.
Yeah.
And
there's so many examples like that, right? Foam from the Texas shutdown last year. Most of the foam producers are in the state of Texas. All of their equipment got frozen over. They shut down for a number of weeks. Any company that needed foam, including Automotive, found themselves with huge supply chain issues to be able to bring to market. So we are very vulnerable. It's the flip side of any sort of climate challenge that we see here. Is this going to create increasing risks to supply chains, and therefore having that understanding of where everything's flowing and resilience and options to be able to maneuver against it. It's both sides of the coin. What's coming out of a changing climate, plus needing to meet our lower emission goals.
Now, one of the ways that manufacturers have dealt with supply base in the past, and they usually do it just to have competitors within certain segments, is that they'll dual source or even more multi-source for a particular component, so that they end up saying, well, they'll play them off against each other for price, but in terms of resiliency and the sustainability story, could you see that playing out, dual sourcing becoming a bigger issue within the manufacturer, maybe even with tier 1 suppliers?
Yeah. I think there's still a desire to be able to dual source. There's advantages that come from the supply chain resilience aspect. Yeah. And so where the battles are going to be fought in terms of winning market share is going to come down to, is it dual sourced 60-40 or dual sourced 80-20? That could be a meaningful difference for any one vehicle program.
Yeah.
And maybe you get the 80-20 instead of the 60-40 because your green credentials are taking you to the next level, right? So things might happen more on the margin, but they're going to be increasingly the deciding factor when you look at somewhat similar technology, somewhat similar footprints, responsiveness, reputation, other pieces. So what's going to be the next advantage that you really lean into? And coming back time after time over these past couple of years is that sustainability is now a competitive advantage if you can make it work.
Yeah, yeah. Now, do you see that the more dual sourcing coming? Do you think that'll be something that'll be coming in the future?
I can't say with certainty that there's going to be more. I'd say that there is a plan to continue to dual source. There is a plan to have regional sourcing to the best of the ability, which may lead to different suppliers for different markets. Yeah. The same battery supplier for a Tesla or a Volkswagen in the US versus Europe versus China. They're different players. Yeah. And there's how the products get designed can be different to suit those markets, and therefore what the requirements can also be different. So depending on how we define dual sourcing for a program, may flex there, and that's why it may be a little bit more difficult for me to say if the trend line is pointing to more dual sourcing or at least an equal amount of what we see today.
Yeah, very good. Rick, did you have anything you wanted to add or ask?
No. Well, there are plenty of discussions points here, but I think there was one thing which which resonated well with me. It's not only in the automotive industry, but it's also coming back to this kind of globalization perspective that we see, that take a UPS and a DHL, and they have to decarbonize their kind of efforts as well, and they want to procure electric vehicles for their own fleets. But then imagine the number of outsourced operations that they have with the small, medium enterprises that have 1, 2 vehicles that need to purchase this electric vehicle, which is twice as expensive as the original diesel vehicle that they currently have. So it's a massive challenge for like also for these major companies that are currently looking into this effectively from a different side of things, and integrating them into the wider system.
We can increase the scale of some of those trucks. It'll bring down the price, and some of the smaller groups might be able to afford them a little better, right?
Yeah, it goes beyond that even. So it's really looking at new kind of collaboration and financing models behind this as well. It's policies, regulations here that kind of stabilize situations here as well. So it really is going to be a shift in terms of the market developments. So beyond just kind of, I liked about Nathan's productions here in the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and the challenges there, but it's also going to be taking place on the other hand of that, effectively.
Yeah, completely agree. Operational complexity goes through the roof when you think about a battery needs to be responsive, not to just its remaining life or the range of the day, but temperature matters, load matters. And so these logistics companies need to take in all of that dynamically. And that's not something that they're necessarily prepared for today, and are going to need a lot of support to work through that journey together.
Yeah, very good. Sina, did you have anything you want to add, or any questions?
No, I just think it's interesting and exciting to see that all, not just like cities, but also private sector, automotive, everyone's going towards the sustainability route and decarbonizing transport. So exciting news.
Very good. Well, I want to thank all three of you for first putting up with our technology snafus.
We made it.
We made it.
And also for the great insights. I think all three presentations gave us good insights into the issue of sustainability and supply chains, and the changes that are happening in goods movement. Not just local, it's local, it's regional, it's global. And I think that we've really got some good insights today on this story. I want to again thank you, and I'm going to close off the conference with just some information about our upcoming conferences. And let me put something up here.
Whilst you put it up, then let me say thank you also for the invitation to speak here. And it was a pleasure, Bruce, to speak today, and also hear from Nathan and Nisina and their respective programs.
Thank you all.
Very good, thank you. Now, as usual, at the every end of every conference, we like to give thanks. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our affiliates who fund our conferences. The next conference is going to be the effects of the Biden administration policies on the U.S. auto industry. Please follow us on LinkedIn. There is a Meet the Speakers program that's coming after this. I think Nathan is the only person who's able to stick around. I will be around as well. If you would, there's a link to that I sent you in the email, as well as there's a link in the bottom of in the description at the YouTube site. If you want to click on that to meet with Nathan or myself, we'll be available for about half an hour after the end of the conference here. And the presentations from the conference will be available. They'll be up on the website this weekend, and hopefully a much edited version of the conference